My name is Professor Janet Soskis from Cambridge University, and I'm very pleased to introduce this session on continuity and change in the life of the community. And our first speaker is Dr. Ahmet Alibasik. Dr. Alibasik is a lecturer in the Faculty of Islamic Studies in the University of Sarajevo, where he teaches a number of courses, including the Introduction to Islamic Civilization, Islamic History, Genocide Studies. He was responsible for organizing the Building Bridges seminar, being very involved in that when that met in Sarajevo. And his doctorate, which was from the University of Sarajevo, focused on Islamic opposition in the Arab world. He's now the director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Sarajevo and a senior associate of the Democratization Policy Council and chairman of the Ghazi Uzref Bey Library. And recently, from 2003 to 2007, he served as deputy president of the Association of Islamic Scholars in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we're very pleased to have him speak now.
Thank you very much for having me here. I was told my presentation is relatively short, so I hope I don't have to skip too much, but I have cut it down a bit still, so I hope I will make it in time. So I'm going to talk about continuity and change in the life of the community, and in particular, what I realized is how Muslim attitudes to change are changing, actually. And this is going to be one of the points. Today, many people in the world keep asking themselves and Muslims, are Islam and Muslims capable of change at all? And is Islam's supposed inability to change the main source of Muslims' frustration? You would, I'm sure, you realized who might be saying this. What this question presupposes is that both Islam and Muslims are impervious to change. Sorry, impervious to change. I never used this word. I don't know why I used it this time. However, the statement that the only constant in history is change is true for Muslim communities as much as it is for others, even when Muslims themselves would like to think that they are not changing. Yet, the question is not completely unjustified, as Islamic sources and heritage appear to be ambiguous towards change. On the one hand, Islam is conceived as a complete religion which needs no further refinement. The Quranic verse referring to this completeness, Al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum, is one of the last Quranic revelations. In addition, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, testified that the first Muslim generations are the best human beings ever to walk the earth. From these and similar texts, some have understood that any change must mean deterioration and deformation, and therefore must be condemned as innovation or bid'ah. Things cannot get better. Eventually, doomsday will befall the worst of all human beings, one hadith says. Therefore, a regressive view of history, Fasad al-Zaman, was developed. After the best of all times, what else one could expect? What is more contextually speaking, Muslims of the first Islamic centuries were in many respects leaders of civilization of the day and felt little outside urge to change what they thought or considered to be a winning formula. Instead, they wanted to preserve and perpetuate the situation. The very popular Quranic statement that verily never will God change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves, or there are different translations, obviously, Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. So this very verse was understood in conjunction with another Quranic verse, which implies that the change would be for worse. This other verse reads, because God will never change the grace which He has bestowed on a people until they change what is in their souls. So the change could only be for worse. And actually, I didn't check all the translations, but the translation of Abdul Hamid says the following: God does not change the condition of a people, in the brackets, for the worse, unless they change what is in themselves. For a variety of socio-political and practical reasons, following earlier authorities and generations, meaning taqlid, became logical and reasonable way to follow. At one point, it became even dangerous to be innovative, to think. Biographers, for example, note that a scholar so-and-so was, among other things, accused of ijtihad. So instead of being the highest state a scholar can attain, ijtihad became a de facto forbidden exercise. So this is one position. The other position, or on the other hand, Islam can be and has been understood as a revolutionary message aimed at transforming social realities, like al-islah. Furthermore, the message of Islam itself is capable of renewal, tajdeed. Independent reasoning, ijtihad, is a tool of that renewal. Blameworthy innovation in the ritual matters, which is called bid'ah or sunnah sayyi'ah, is to be clearly distinguished from the praiseworthy innovation in other areas of human activity, sunnah hasana. Taqlid is a way of those who refuse the message, not its followers. And then, for instance, Quran says, when it is said to them, to non-believers, follow what God has revealed, they say, no, we shall follow the ways of our fathers. And then Quran comments, what? Even though their fathers were void of wisdom and guidance. So taqlid here gets a negative reputation. Also, there are other traditions like al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min. So the wisdom is the things which believer lost. So wherever he finds it, he is the first, he is the most, he is entitled to reclaim it. History is neither regressive nor progressive in this view, but cyclical. Quran says, such days of varying fortunes we give to man and man by turns. So, tilka ayyamun nudawiluha bayna nas. So things don't have necessarily to go from bad to worse. Change is not necessarily bad news, especially in later centuries when the conditions of the community became unsatisfying anyway. The emphasis shifted to the prophetic saying that God will raise at the head of each century people for this community who will revive its religion for it. إن الله يبعث على لهذه الأمة على رأس كل 100 عام من يجدد لها دينها. Now, grace is in action, in movement and change. Al-Barakah fil Harakah is a very popular saying. I don't know where it comes really, whether it's part of any tradition, but it's a very popular, became very popular amongst contemporary Muslims. Now, this ambiguous or multi-interpretable tradition has resulted in different styles of social action, as one scholar says, that is, different attitudes towards change among Muslims throughout history, and especially in relation to incentives coming from other religious communities. One could discern 3 or 4 attitudes to change. One, and here we can work on the terminology, I am aware of that. One is accommodation. The other one is conservatism. The third one is total rejection of change in the name of some post-utopian model, and something that I have called here reformism. So these are the 4. Now, first on the accommodation. Many Muslims throughout history have been open to change and willing to adjust to it by pragmatically adopting or simply adopting outside influences in political, intellectual, and even spiritual spheres. Many Muslim rulers, from early Umayyads to the 19th and 20th century, modernizers readily adopted solutions from other political systems. Similarly, certain Muslim intellectuals have done the same in the fields of philosophy, logic, and science in general, starting with ancient Greek and Indian knowledge, all the way up to modern Western scholarship. Perhaps more surprisingly, even spiritual and religious men, most often Sufis, but not only them, have not resisted the appeal of novel things coming from other traditions or with new times. On one side, this approach has enabled Muslims to cope with change, to connect with others, and to build Islamic civilization within a relatively short span of time. Contemporary advocates of this approach have hoped that in our times, this approach will enable Muslims to overcome their many deficiencies and catch quickly with the developed world. In answer to the question of why this has not happened yet, they point to Muslims' hesitance actually to adopt Western solutions. In other words, the therapy is correct, but has not been taken long enough or in sufficient doses. Of course, accommodation is promoted not only by Westernized Muslims, but they are its most fervent advocates. Now, while the gains of this approach are undeniable, there have been side effects as well. Syncretism, alienation, estrangement, and deviations of all sorts among them. Those side effects have often provoked reactions in the Muslim community in the forms of conservatism, extreme rejection, or reformism, which are the other three styles of Muslim attitude or response to change. Now, let's go next to conservatism. When compromises and borrowings from other cultures reach visible proportions, they often become disturbing to more conservative segments of the community, who then start emphasizing the need to preserve what was achieved. Obviously, the fact that there would have not been too much to preserve had it not been for non-conservative attitude of those who produce those achievements is often overlooked. The texts and the traditions encouraging mistrust of innovation are given prominence over all other traditions. The Ummah is reminded that the direction is more important than the speed. What is the point actually of competing on the same track with communities and civilizations whose ultimate goals you may not share? Backwardness is not the worst thing that can happen to Muslim community. Actually, being wrong or being in dalal is, and following wrong models, pursuing false aims and goals is the real danger. And Professor Sayyid Hussein Nasr actually has very eloquently spoken on these issues. This attitude has helped to stabilize the community and keep the compromises within the generally acceptable range. This in turn has enabled the preservation of gains made by preceding accommodations. Today, probably most Muslims fall within this category. Yet, the conservatives are not completely inimical to change. They too have invented their own ways and means of dealing with changing world, mostly predicated on the concepts of necessity and lesser of two evils. And here I have in mind concepts of darura, umum al-balwa, akhaf al-dararain, or respect for local customs, urf and ada. So these have been used to justify the accommodation of change. Besides, Sunni traditionalism often verges on accommodationism because of its political conservatism, which considers 1 hour of political chaos, fitna, to be worse than the long periods of tyranny. There are various, is it 60 days, is it centuries, so it's just long periods. And in this Sunni tradition, political accommodation is almost a matter of principle, not just one of expedience. So early rationalists and later modernists are not the only accommodationists, actually. There is, however, difference between the two groups, the accommodationists and the traditionalists, in the sense that they tend to be, the first group tends to be active in accommodating change or proactive, while traditionalists simply follow what they think they cannot afford to neglect or resist. This attitude has saved the community from some misfortunes of social engineering, but has exposed it also to influences by negative outside developments much more than by the positive ones, I would dare say. For instance, in political life, this often meant that Muslims will accept almost every evil that befell the community or was forced upon the Muslim community. By insisting on taqlid, most of traditionalists have given up the idea of being leaders of change in the first place. Of course, I'm aware here of what, for instance, Wael Hallaq says about the positive role of taqlid in certain instances. For instance, he says judges have to be, conservative, and judges are not supposed to invent new things every day, So in certain areas, taqlid is perfectly justified. Now, the third attitude is what I have called reformism, for the lack of better term, where accommodation leads to too many compromises and where conservatism prevents the community from advancing, reformism sets in. Historically, its causes have been syncretism, foreign aggression, intellectually stifling taqlid, corruption, or general decline of the ummah. Reformism strives both to reconstruct the society in moral terms, this is what we usually call al-islah, and to redefine and reinterpret major teachings of Islam, which is usually called al-tajdeed. By combining socio-moral reconstruction and reconstruction of religious thought, reformists simultaneously aspire to change their environment and accept to be changed. In such a way, the often disturbing gap between Islamic ideals and social realities narrow down immediately. In some reformist movements, reinterpretation aspect is emphasized more than the reform aspect, while in others, social reform is in focus. In both cases, reformist groups face disapproval both from the establishment, who tend to be accommodationists, and general community, which tends to be more conservative. The establishment is often disturbed by the social reform aspect of reformist message, while conservatives are annoyed by its tajdeedi spirit. In recent history, particularly brutal in this respect, were several Arab regimes in the second half of the 20th century, Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Iraq, Libya. Today, one can gladly state that most of them are gone with the recent winds of change. I'm going to just briefly mention the fourth group, which is like, some call them fundamentalists, some call them, militant extremists, probably. This is the group which has risen from time to time, and they also want change, actually, but that change, which implies destroying the society that exists and creating an idealized utopia. No such plan has ever succeeded in creating sustainable change. Of course, groups evolve. Groups are not, these are ideal types. We have just heard of certain Harijites moving all the way from probably the last group to traditionalists, and there are groups who are modernists or individuals who were modernists and then turned reformists, or those who were extremists moved to reformists. So things are dynamic here. Now, the second thing I want to highlight in my presentation is the changing criteria of acceptable change. What I mean here is that this is really what struck me. The common position used to be on this issue, what is acceptable, what is actually the criterion of acceptable change. What I previously used to read and hear is that anything that is based on uncontestable qat'i evidence, both in terms of its authenticity and definite meaning, is unchangeable. Those of you familiar with the, usul al-fiqh will know that certain texts are considered to be, clear and indisputable in terms of their authenticity. So when a norm is based on such a text, you can't really, there is no way to change it. And an example of that would be Islamic norms of inheritance. It's in the Quran and it's numbers. So there is very little space for interpretation, really. Half is half, third is third. So there is little space for maneuver there. And they say, La ijtihada ma'a nas. They call it nas. So you can't do any ijtihad, basically. That's it. To this criterion, another one, less precise, is often added, which is al-ma'lum min ad-dini bi-darura. You can't change the things that are known to be part of the deen by necessity. Okay, so this is obviously more vague, but these are like the two criteria that were mentioned often. However, more recently, another criterion, completely different actually, is being put forward, and this is higher objectives of Sharia, the maqasid al-Sharia. Now, if maqasid al-Sharia are new yardstick for what is changeable and what is not changeable, that really promises, to open a lot of opportunities, because now, even when a norm based on qat'i evidence is accepted, you can easily go around it by simply saying, okay, this norm stands, but if in this particular situation it's not leading us to the desired goal or objective, then it's actually not applicable in this situation. It stands where it leads to the proclaimed goal. If it is not, then you can bypass it. And again, inheritance is an example. I was listening to a scholar who says, yes, males should inherit twice the portion of the female or a daughter, but then that was in a society where males were taking financial responsibility for the family. If we have now, and that was just in such a context, if we have a situation now where basically sons and daughters, wife and husband share financial responsibility, to still continue dividing the old ways would be actually very, very unjust. So in that way, you can bypass even things that are based on the qat'i evidence. So I'm running out of time. The last thing I wanted to how many minutes exactly do I have? More than 5. I'll try to do this in 5 minutes. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is the Arab Spring as a case study in the different attitudes to change. Let me try to read and hopefully be faster. The Arab Spring that ensued following the self-immolation of the Tunisian street vendor Mohamed Abu Azizi on the 17th of December 2010 is certainly the most dramatic change the Muslim world has recently seen. The reactions to this chain of events have varied significantly, as we all know. Almost ironically, all those in power against whom the revolutions were directed hailed from the accommodationist trend in the Muslim community. That is from amongst those who should have least problems with accepting the change. But obviously their illiberalism overruled their modernism. Somewhat more predictably, many traditional Muslim scholars and more conservative reformists, Salafis, sided with the established governments, or at least were not sure until quite late what side to take. You probably all know about former Egyptian Mufti, the late Syrian scholar Muhammad Sayyid Ramadan al-Bouti, rahmatullah alayhi, who stood with and defended Assad's regime until his unfortunate death. many Salafis in Egypt consider their performance during the Egyptian revolution to be embarrassing, and this is the word they use. And, but, you know, whatever one may think, one has to admit that these people and these groups were truthful actually to a well-established Sunni tradition of loyalty to the authorities, whoever they may be. Many people find the traditionalist assessment of the Arab Spring bewildering, though, however. While the views expressed in the popular publication called the 500 Most Influential Muslims might not be shared by all traditionalists, they obviously are representative of the large section of this trend. And in introduction to the 2011 edition of this publication, its editor writes that the real heroes of change in Tunisia and Egypt were not street demonstrators, but the army. Now, I'm going to read just part of it. In neither Egypt nor Tunisia were the rulers overthrown by street demonstrators. In both cases, it was the army that decided to send off Ben Ali and Mubarak. In other words, the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt did not overthrow the social or political order, but were soft coups d'etat that may or may not lead to reforms on one hand or future bloodbaths on the other. Now, we don't have time to read everything. So when it was impossible to deny change anymore, the author is trying to assign it or associate it with a traditional institution, which is the army. Traditionalists have already accepted armies in Muslim societies as a traditional institution. So it has to go there. It cannot be street demonstrators, because there are no street demonstrators in our books. In our toolkit, they are not there. So you have a problem. You have rebels, you know, you have armed uprisers, rebels, but you don't have peaceful street demonstrators. So what to do with them? So deny them this role. Applying the same approach, the volume itself estimates that the reformist figures such as Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Amr Khalid, and other supporters of the protests were actually the losers. They have this like barometer, you know, who gained, who lost in the Arab Spring. And then you have people who supported the Arab Spring. They are given like thumbs down, huh? How do you say that? Many others, of course, think that liberal modernists and mainstream reformists are the movers and bigger winners of the Arab Spring. There are some very strange traditional voices, I have to say. If you listen, for instance, frankly, I'm not an expert on this scholar. Sheikh Imran Hussein is very popular among some youth in the Balkans. But when you listen to what he has to say about what's going on in the Middle East, in the Arab world, sorry, it's very strange. You know, he quotes Surah Ar-Rum, the opening chapter, which talks about, you know, Byzantians being closer to the Muslim community than the Persians, because Persians are, you know, fire worshippers and whatever. And then he draws various analogies how Russia today is actually Byzantium, and how Muslims should align themselves with the Russians, and it really gets it's difficult even to follow, you know. But let's leave those puzzling positions aside and continue. And while it's too early to assess the Arab Spring's impact on Islamic political thinking, some reflections might be already justified. Like classical Islamic political thought, contemporary Islamic thinking has been ambiguous on issues of political change. Much Islamic political thinking suffers from the false dichotomies, either stability and tyranny or anarchy and change, whereby tyranny always seemed to be a lesser evil because of the traumas of fitna, which we listen to. Hence comes the tendency of the scholars to side with the powers of the day. However, recent Arab revolutions have put this thinking and political culture to an unprecedented test. Many Islamic scholars performed poorly during the revolutions by siding with the old regimes, giving contradictory statements, or keeping silent. As a result, their credibility and authority have significantly depleted. The revolutions blasted away not only political leaders and regimes, but threatened to blast away some religious ideas and leaders as well. Under certain conditions, stability is no more the value of highest order. Overall, the Arab Spring has had a humbling effect on many Muslim scholars and ideas. It has resulted in the demands for comprehensive revisions of certain interpretations of Islamic norms. Some have even called this revision a neglected duty of today. And you probably, some of you remember what Muslim extremists called to be neglected duty of the 20th century. Okay, thank you. I'm done, almost done. It was like jihad is the neglected duty. Now, you have people who call this reinterpretation actually to be the long neglected duty of Muslims. This is not to say that Islamic thought has not evolved prior to revolutions, but the pace of change has accelerated since then and has included previously rarely debated issues such as the transition of power. Of course, these debates will be very much affected by the outcomes of the Arab revolutions. If these revolutions eventually prove to be successful, to bring betterment to the community, then one can expect the traditional position which favors stability to be, reviewed. However, if, like in Syria and probably Egypt, the revolutions lead to more bloodshed, more suffering, don't bring any positive change around, then actually traditionalist position might be further strengthened. So to conclude, despite claims of Muslim and non-Muslim fundamentalists, both distant and recent histories provide ample evidence actually of the ability of Muslims and Islam to simultaneously change and assure continuity. The great turbulence which we have been observing during the last century or so is nothing but a sign that a major reinterpretation of the great tradition of Islam is taking place. The dust over the events of the Arab Spring has not settled yet, but the Islamic thinking on change and its desirability is evolving rapidly. Unless these events take a terribly wrong turn, future Muslim attitudes to change might be reasonably expected to be much more positive. Thank you for your attention.
Now for our final speaker, Dr. Brandon Gallagher from the University of Oxford. Dr. Gallagher is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at Regent's Park College, which he finished a doctorate at not too long ago. His studies after McGill University in Canada were at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. He is himself an Orthodox Christian, and he then came to Oxford, where he did a doctorate on freedom and necessity in Trinitarian thought, in the thought of Bulgakov, Karl Barth, and von Balthasar, which is shortly to be published as a book, Freedom and Necessity in Modern Theology, coming out with Oxford University Press. And now his current work, he does a lot of work for the Orthodox community and in Orthodox theology, but his current work is on the question of secularism and ecclesiology, particularly looking at papal primacy and modern Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology. Dr. Gallagher.
This is such a huge area, modern ecclesiology, and so I want to necessarily narrow its focus. So I want to look and to begin with one of the major ecclesial and theological and indeed ecumenical events in the Christian West, and use that as a window, as it were. And this is the Roman Catholic Ecumenical Council of Vatican II from 1962 to 1965. And this is a good place to start because it consulted widely with other Christians, so Protestants and Orthodox as well as other religions, indeed. And so It was called by John the 23rd, and it was essentially he wanted it to respond positively to modernity and offering up the resources of the Christian gospel on issues as diverse as human rights, non-Christian religions, and religious freedom. And also in a very careful and critical way to bring up to date, aggiornamento, this is a key kind of Italian phrase, the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church was faced at that time with a world that was, as it were, post-Christendom, and even becoming in the mid-1960s almost post-Christian. Yves Congar, who was a famous theologian, Christian theologian, Catholic, and who drafted a lot of the text, said that the church no longer carries the world within herself like a pregnant mother. And so he said the church needed a new style for her presence in the world. And here, in order to bring across this search for a new style across the Christian divisions, I want to use something which Professor D'Acosta had mentioned, this notion of ecclesiology ad intra, looking sort of inwards, but also ecclesiology ad extra. How does the church face the world, that which is external to it? This comes from Cardinal Sunan in a December 1962 speech. Now, ad intra, we'll look at communion ecclesiology, this notion that the church is an event of communion in the body of Christ, which is understood as a mystical body, an extension of the incarnation, and a divine human organism. And this is something which is shared by all the Christian groups and is indeed found within the ecumenical movement. And for ad extra, for the church in response to the world, we're going to look at liberation theology, the Latin American form of liberation theology, but then also I'll touch on the various liberation or contextual theology, so feminist ecclesiology. But before we get into that, I just want to do a couple kind of distinctions, which I think might be helpful here. The first is a term which was used during Vatican II, ressourcement, a French kind of term, which is hard to translate. Might be resourcing, renewal, return to the sources. It was a term used by people like Congar, Danelou, Henri de Laubach. They were all involved with the council, French theologians, and they felt that if Christian theologians returned to the sources of Christian tradition, such as the Bible and the Christian fathers, St. Augustine, the liturgical tradition, they felt that this would lead to a renewal of both the theology and of the church itself, more broadly. Now, this term can be used in other contexts as well. So the Orthodox had their version of ressourcement called neopatristic synthesis, and they turned to the Greek fathers and to the liturgy. So you get people like, for example, George Florovsky, Vladimir Lossky, and indeed the Protestants with the so-called movement of Protestant neo-orthodoxy with Karl Barth. And in a way, this can be seen as a type of ressourcement. In this case, they were turning to Scripture itself, trying to understand the transcendence of God, to the magisterial reformers. So, ressourcement, very important kind of term. But, you know, what sort of context are we dealing with here that the church, the Catholic Church in particular, was responding to? Well, it was responding at that time to a world which, during the 19th century, the Catholic Church was reacting, essentially, to the Enlightenment. And now, to the Enlightenment ideal of obtaining eternal and universal knowledge, the Church responded with something that is called neo-scholastic theology, which is a sort of, to caricature it, a sort of ahistorical, rational systematization of Christian teaching. And this made the Church suspicious of not only the most scientific developments, but also of the application of these methods to the study of the development of doctrine and the evolution of the Bible. And one of the key texts for this is Leo XIII's, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical in 1879 of Aeterni Patris, which kind of took Thomism, a particular version of Thomism, which didn't necessarily have anything to do with Thomas, as a Christian philosophy to counter secular philosophy. And the church then again reacted. For example, in 1870, in my reading of the thing, it saw itself as the bastion of infallible truth in reaction to scientific truth, which was a type of infallible truth in opposition to it. So all of these various different things made the church reactionary. And so indeed, many of the figures who were key in Vatican II, so for example, Congar and Karl Rahner, they were at different points before Vatican II under censure. Rahner even months before the council itself. So the other term I want to look at is aggiornamento. And this is an important term from the Italian meaning to adapt, to renew, to renovate, and even at times perhaps to reform. And John the 23rd has a good line, a very famous line, where he says that I want to throw open the windows to the church so that we can see out and people can see in. And in a way, a lot of 20th century modern ecclesiology is exactly that. It's an attempt, at the same time understanding the church, who it sees itself to be in herself, but also trying to respond to the world and to a world which is not Christian. So aggiornamento. But let's turn now to ecclesiology ad intra. This is the idea of the church as a divine human organism. Now, Professor DaCosta mentioned this helpfully in his thing. This is understood where the church is a living mystical body. And it's a variant of the biblical image of the model of the church as the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians, for example, 12. And the key thinker here is a Catholic thinker for seeing the development of this idea is Johann Adam Müller, who in 1825 published a text called Unity in the Church. And he said that the Spirit of Christ is the life-giving and life-forming principle that animates the body of Christ, understood as this divine human organism, an extension of the incarnation, as the fullness of all the believers in him, understood as a holy people, a priestly nation. And this priestly nation together comprise a spiritual unity. Now, the church is then understood as an extension of the incarnation in history. And this idea of communion ecclesiology is very influential, and you find it indeed in the World Council of Churches document, Baptism, Eucharist, Ministry. But it's influential in many figures, and one good illustration of this would be the modernist, he was excommunicated, Catholic priest, George Tyrrell, 19th century, early 20th century priest. And he says, the church is not merely a society, because you'll remember the idea of a perfect society, or a school, but a mystery and a sacrament, like the humanity of Christ, of which it is an extension. So, how is this reality of the church as a mystical body, how does it come to be? And here it's helpful to look at the work of Henri de Lubac in his Mystique, or in his text, which I will get to. Corporis Mysticum. And he talks about the Eucharist as a mystical principle by which the church becomes itself, becomes the reality of the body of Christ. So the Eucharist makes the church. Now, all of these things are taken up in Lumen Gentium, which is a text which was mentioned before. All these ideas of the Church of Sacrament as the ongoing incarnation, and other Christian groups take them up as well. So, for example, the Orthodox. And the Orthodox, some of the key figures here would be Alexei Komiakov, a 19th century figure, John Zazoulis, a Greek theologian, and indeed, other figures like Vladimir Lossky and Afanasiev, and they want to emphasize that the church is a freedom, a church is a unity in difference, a free kind of unity, and that wherever the Eucharist is celebrated, not only does the church come to be, but it is perfectly Catholic. So this is also taken up by the Protestants, and they take their unique perspective to do with this, and they want to emphasize the church as a covenanting community, where everyone is able to freely in acts of faith, is bonded together as a community, bond themselves with Christ, and the unity then is there. And some key thinkers here would be Paul Fiddes and Miroslav Volf. So, we have some sense then of this ecclesiology ad intra. But what about the church in response to the world outside of itself? And here I want to look at liberation theology, ecclesiology ad extra. And now liberation theology is a fairly complex phenomenon. And here it has arguably two sources. Now, the first source is in the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher, another German theologian, this time a Protestant in the 19th century. And he argued that there was a universal feeling of absolute dependence on God as the source of all life and being. And God, therefore, is given to us directly in this feeling. He reveals himself in this understanding of this consciousness, this human experience. But the consciousness or the feeling never appears in a general form, but it's always specific to a particular community, and where there's a unique modification of the feeling of absolute dependence. So, for example, within Catholicism and Protestantism, there is a modification of this feeling, this experience, which is unique to each of those communities, but it's focused on redemption through Jesus Christ. So, with this feeling of absolute dependence, there's no unchanging essence of the church. Or of theology for that matter, but there are only particular expressions of the general concepts that are in constant flux as the community and its members' experiences change. So, for example, the Reformed Lutheran Prussian Union Church of Schleiermacher would have a particular ecclesiology and a particular practice, and that would be different than, for example, the churches which Leonardo Boff, the base communities in Brazil, he's a controversial Catholic theologian, or indeed then, for example, the church in Syria. Each one would be different. So, Schleiermacher's ecclesiology is only one of the roots of this ecclesiology ad extra, liberation theology that I want to look at. And the second one is the magisterial documents, the church's official teaching, where seen in particularly in the 1965 Pastoral Constitution of the Church, Gaudium et Spes. And here, in these documents, broadly understood, this document in particular, the work for justice and equality, the response of the church to all the things that are happening to the world are understood as constitutive aspects of the Christian gospel. So in its famous lines, the joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. So the church in these documents, the Catholic Church, was trying to respond to dialogue, this is a key term, with every aspect of humanity, with atheism, with human rights, to do with unions, private property, and it also was working towards, without getting too political, an equitable society. This was of, it says in the documents, a vital concern for the church. Now, this type of teaching during Vatican II was, after it, was built on by the Catholic Church in other teaching from the Pope. So Progressio Populorum of Pope Paul VI in 1967 critiques capitalism and works towards a social gospel or social justice. And then in 1971, you have the Catholic Synod of Bishops in Rome, who says that social justice is a constitutive aspect of the Christian gospel. Now, the rest of the world was listening to all of this official teaching, and in Latin America, they had various bishop conferences in Medellin, Colombia in 1968, and in Puebla, Mexico in 1969. And here they were building on a long tradition of the church being involved in social change and working towards social justice. For example, a key figure here would be Bartolome de las Casas, who was a 15th and 16th century Dominican friar who worked for social justice. So the idea, as it was understood by the Latin American bishops, was that the church needed to have fraternal solidarity with the poor. They needed to have action was required to change society. The gospel is something which transforms society, social structures. And justice, this is an important term in these documents, and not just justice in an abstract sense, but justice in an economic and political sense. And here they identify Christ and the church with poverty. And you'll remember that Pope Francis keeps going on about poverty. He says that he wants a poor church, a poor church for the poor. And he's said that one of his encyclicals that he's planning is on poverty. So he's taking from this whole tradition. Now, a number of key thinkers in this Latin American trajectory of theology would be Gustavo Gutierrez, who was involved with these bishops' councils. And he wrote a famous book in 1971 called The Theology of Liberation. And he emphasizes liberating praxis. And this is a hallmark. He takes this from some German theologians like Jürgen Moltmann and Metz. And he is interested, he thinks that truth is not some abstract kind of ideal. It's something which comes through liberating action, which transforms the present, where you have an identity with the poor. Now, all of this, as you can see, might have worried the Vatican. And indeed, in the 1980s, under John Paul II and his doctrinal watchdog, probably quite rude, was the future Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger. And here they got very worried about the Marxist undertones of a lot of this liberation theology. And so they critiqued it, and they silenced certain key figures. So Leonardo Boff was silenced, ex-Franciscan priest, Sebastian Kappen, and Tissa Bellasuria. Some of these names were mentioned by Professor Da Costa. Now, Boff is an interesting figure who I just want to briefly mention. He emphasizes the fact that the community, the church community, is which he calls a base community, is something which is continually evolving. You'll remember Schleiermacher. It's a church of the poor, and it is able to rethink the church from the ground up. So he talks about ecclesiogenesis. The church is reinvented, he says. So he proposes lay celebration of the Eucharist, women's ordination. So it's not a surprise that the church eventually silenced him. Now, these sorts of ideas were also, other people were listening to what was going on in Latin America. And so they're taken up by other movements. So during the 1960s, the civil rights movement of African Americans working for liberation, and then the feminist movement in the early 1970s. So they no longer looked at injustice as the main sin, and that Christ is poor and he's working for justice in the community. But he looked particularly, for example, James H. Cohen, with his 1970 A Black Theology of Liberation. And he looked at racism, white racism, as the thing towards which the church needed to work against. And the community then, its experience becomes this movement towards liberation from racism. And Christ is said to be black. And God himself is said to be black because he completely identifies with his people. And you get the same things as well in feminism, where sexism is said to be the evil which the church is working towards. And then the church then becomes a body where there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, a liberating body in which women are empowered. And then once again, more recently, in North America, in Britain, and you have homosexual or gay ecclesiologies, where people in the lesbian, gay, and transsexual and bisexual community see themselves as having people being prejudiced against them for homophobia. And so they believe that the church is a queered body. This is the language that they use. And that only through being able to enter in a thing where heterosexuality is not made the norm, heteronormativity is the term they use, that one's sexuality is affirmed. Now, all of this type of liberation or contextual theologies also were taken up in the local parts of the world. So in the last 40 years, unique ecclesiologies have developed, especially in Africa and in Asia, in these contexts. And these are post-colonial, where they're trying to define the church outside of a purely Western context. And here they want to bring in elements of their unique culture and affirm those elements. Now, the last thing before I get to my kind of concluding remarks that I wanted to mention is a very new area indeed, which is relevant to our discourse, which is the area of which combines interreligious dialogue and ecclesiology. And this has happened particularly in the World Council of Churches. So in 2005, there was a document called Religious Plurality and Christian Self-Understanding. And this document tried to understand the church as a body in reference to other religions and to the world. And it took God's hospitality to all of creation as its premise, and concludes that Christians faced with religious plurality cannot claim salvation uniquely to themselves. And even more recently, another document is being written, which is going to be discussed in November in the World Council of Churches meeting in Busan. And this is called Christian Self-Understanding in the Context of Religious Plurality. And again, it's looking at other religions, and this time it does it from the framework of the Trinity. So here you have these ecclesiologies ad extra, the church trying to respond to diversity and to affirm that diversity. But there are problems. And in my conclusion, which I'll now turn to, let's look at a few of those difficulties. So the church is facing a world which no longer is simply an extension of its own cultural and religious patrimony, a culture that is post-Christendom and even post-Christian. Christian theology is, if it's to flourish in this new millennium, then it certainly cannot ignore the fact of pluralism or the new interreligious landscape, non-Western cultures. However, taken to an extreme, these visions of particular groups and how they interpret the community of Jesus Christ can easily degenerate into, in the phrase of T.S. Eliot, a wilderness of mirrors, where the unity of the body is found in the face of its one head. Christ can never be seen amongst the endless proliferations of different images of Jesus. So the queer Christ, the feminist Christ, and even I, the other day, came across a theology of liberation for the deaf. So I think you get my point. So a wilderness of mirrors. So where is the one Christ in this? And if there is so many different Christs, is there one God? Do Christians worship the one God? On the other extreme, communion ecclesiology can degenerate into a self-referential life, a mystic communion of light and grace for the initiated, consummated in the Eucharist, with no reference to the irreducible particularity of the world and other faiths, other than as a territory to be annexed through mission. More scandalously, if, as Henri de Lubac says, the Eucharist makes the church, then how can the body of Christ claim to be united with its one head when it manifestly is, as Lucy Gardner showed, divided into all these warring groups? Once again, do these bodies truly worship the same God? Where indeed is the body of Christ? And now here, the two churches with the most universal self-understandings, Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, also have the most developed ecclesiologies of communion, where each asserts its identity as the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and creates elaborate canonical fences to prevent intercommunion with one another, thus bolstering their privileged self-identity and sacralized self-isolation. Protestant churches and the Anglican Communion, in contrast, practice an open communion, where all are invited to the Lord's table, which at its extremes makes communion a celebration not of unity, but difference itself, as if the church was a Christiform version of contemporary multiculturalism. So I think that Christian ecclesiology needs to steer between these two extremes. On the one hand, it must be aware that it can only be itself and be one and come to know Jesus Christ as its body and head when he leads them in remembering his saving words in the breaking of the bread and the drinking of the cup. So it is just as crucial to realize there are bounds to the Christian church as it is to be charitable about acknowledging the legitimacy of the interpretation of the Word of God of other Christians, and indeed of other religions, and so accepting them in unity in some sense. There is no easy and final harmonization of these ecclesiological tensions, as Christian unity and the Christian church is not only a divine gift, but a created desire for the inconceivable. And where there is desire, there will be difference.
Ahmed, and when you moved into your description of conservative Islam, you just barely mentioned the difference between change and innovation. And in my experience in the Gulf, change is welcome, innovation is not. Would you comment on that, please?
One, I was thinking when I sat down, one ways of proceeding actually, and in a way making change more acceptable is actually to clearly define and conceptualize this, what is innovation? Because almost every Muslim will agree that innovation is not acceptable. The problem is that some definitions are too broad, or even worse, might not be clear at all. So you are right to point out that actually what is needed is clear distinction to actually say what in the change is considered innovation, and then the rest is, well, I didn't go into that, but I agree with you very much that, and the short answer would be that innovation is supposed to be related only to the ritual issues and matters, nothing else. Of course, there are areas where it's not like technology and those issues where it's not problematic, but when it comes to social issues, then there it becomes problematic. Whether change is innovation or not, then that's a borderline territory, you know, where it becomes much more difficult to say whether it's innovation or not. I hope I answered the question.
A small, not a question, but a small contribution, maybe according to the Islamic tradition, maybe the tradition of Mu'az, Hadith Mu'az, as you remember, when the Prophet sent Mu'az bin Jabal to Yemen, he said that with what on what ground you will judge, or according to Quran, if you cannot find the solution. This answer is very important because it shows that every solution we cannot find in the Quran. And second question, if I will depend on Quran, if you cannot find on the ground of your sunnah, your practice, against the Prophet Muhammad says that if you cannot find the solution. This shows also that at that time you cannot find every solution in the practice of the prophets. At the end, he says that even you cannot find in the sunnah of the prophet, I make my independent reasoning, ijtihad. So as a textual evidence, it can helps you to maybe the necessity of the changing. And another small point has to do as al-baraka fi al-haraka. There is a book, al-baraka fi fadl al-sa'i wal-haraka lil-Hubayshi al-Yamani.
I've seen
It's a unique book, I think, in this title. This is what can I say?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for both.
Thank you so much. I have 2 questions for each of the speakers. Thank you so much for your papers. With respect to your invocation of the verse لا يغير الله ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم, don't you think that would leave some room for innovation, even if it is really frowned upon as a matter of religious principle? The other thing also, you talked about the positive change towards the very end of your remarks in the context of the Arab Spring. Can you shed some light about the erosion, for example, of women's rights after the Arab Spring? We see diminishing, devaluation of women. I recently came across a very interesting piece about how the Arab Spring actually reconfigured the notion of the urban public space in which women has no place. So if you can just touch on that.
Can you just rephrase your first question? Sorry, I'm not sure I got the point you wanted.
Yeah. You said you invoked the verse about change. Okay, but at the same time you talked about the issue of innovation as something that is unacceptable. But in terms of the tafsir or the interpretation, don't you think that this verse also lends itself to a tafsir or interpretation that could be amenable to innovation? Okay, my other question to the other speaker, which I really enjoyed very much. With the Vatican, for example, at St. Francis going forward, do you think that there is anything within the change that took place in recent months? You talked about 2 pathways. Do you think that Pope Francis could push the agenda forward, the agenda that you talked about in terms of change? Thank you.
Yeah. On the first question, thank you for both. On the first question, probably there is some misunderstanding. When I said that this verse is interpreted in a way that it signifies that change is going to be for worse, this is how it usually used to be understood in the light of the other verse. Of course, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, especially more recent commentators, this is exactly the verse which serves as a platform and encouragement for action and for change. So I definitely think yes. But you saw even from the translation, one of the translation I just mentioned, it was, interpreted in a way that means only for change, could be for worse. As for the rights of women and the Arab Spring, yes, many of things we are witnessing are really worrying, not just in relation to women, but are worrying. I must admit, I don't follow everything, but I was encouraged, for instance, by the declarations or statements of the Tunisian Nahda leadership that they will, they will not reverse any reforms and any rights and freedoms that Tunisian women have already achieved. They will try to build on. So these are encouraging. Of course, some other news are discouraging. So this is time of great turmoil, and of course we all watch what's going on with great hope, but also with a lot of fear. And I agree with you. And this is probably time to take some action as well, not just to watch. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. My reading of the situation, I mean, it's very hard because he's only been in power a few months. But one of the things that people have pointed to is recently he set up a consultative kind of council of which was geographical, of different cardinals to help him in dealing with general issues to do with governance. Now, one of the things that some people have pointed out that was never really taken up from the Vatican II documents was the idea of conciliarity. This is this idea that the Roman Catholic Church is this maybe is not obvious, but it is not just ruled by the Pope and by those around him in the Curia or the court, the sort of bureaucrats, but it is also a church which is represented. It represents the holy people of God in the bishops, and so. Enacting something which Vatican II insisted on, Paul VI set up a synod. But this synod, which meets, every 3-4 years or something like that, every 5 years, hasn't had much, not really any teeth. So people are wondering, perhaps what will happen with Francis is that he will bring in, it will decentralize the Catholic Church. Because a lot of the problems, for example, to do with the whole sexual abuse crisis, for example, arguably have to do with over-centralization. So these priests who were sort of be transferring from diocese to diocese or from parish to parish in a diocese, I should say, the local bishops had no authority to defrock them. And so their cases had to just be sent on to Rome and were dealt with by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. So if you had a decentralization, it would make it easier for the local bishops to be able to, as it were, govern the church, which is indeed their particular part of their particular charism. I think their main charism, if the Catholic Church really wants to get down to it, is teaching. But anyways, that's one of the good things that Francis has done. The second good thing, which may come out of this, is his concern for those who are the poor. One phrase I think I in trying to summarize my rather verbose paper, didn't mention is the preferential option for the poor. This is a key phrase. And we know from his sister, because there's an interview of Pope Francis's sister, she said rather casually that, oh yes, he believes in the preferential option for the poor. I think an emphasis on social justice, you'll see this more with him. And I read last night that there's a rumor that he will allow Benedict XVI to finish his encyclical on faith, and Francis will put his name to it. And then the next encyclical that he will write, and usually these are joint efforts, will be on poverty. And that would be a real change of direction, taking something which Jesuits are known for, working with the poor, and as it were, putting the imprimatur, the stamp, the official stamp, without all the Marxist rhetoric.
My question to Professor Alibasi. When you were discussing the criteria of acceptable change, you mentioned that a change, according to one of the schools you highlighted, will be acceptable as long as it does not conflict with the text-based regulation, especially if it is known to be definitive in origin or in significance or meaning, قطعية الدلالة والثبوت, or that it does not conflict with something that is known to be in religion by necessity, but you also mentioned the emergence of a new criteria that is the objective approach, the maqasid. But my question is, to what extent do you think that this new approach, the maqasid-based approach, is different from the text-based approach, especially in light of some jurists like Shatibi and others said that an objective has to be text-based. So do you see some circularity there?
Yeah, I see a lot of potential in this maqasid approach, although, as you rightly indicated, maqasid approach can be taken really to radical levels, and you can stay where Shatibi basically stayed. So this is obviously not the majority of today's Muslim scholars, but we see more and more literature and more Islamic scholars taking this really just as a starting position and trying to develop completely new usul fiqh, or the methodology of Islamic jurisprudence. And only if that happens, then we will be able to see the fruits of this promise, of maqasid approach. Traditionally, maqasid were just used like heuristic tool, but what we have seen last few years in the literature that is coming out is that people are asking actually and advocating for maqasid to become a criterion for or based on which we will define norms. This is obviously a turn, and this is the promising maqasid approach. Otherwise, if it just stays as post-fact theoretization of classically derived norms, not much is going to change, I would say.
Dr. Brandon, thank you very much to both speakers. Dr. Brandon, in your speech, you were talking about change and homophobia and change, and I think it's very interesting, and that my question pertains to that exactly, to both speakers. In light of change and seeing that homosexuality is being accepted in many Western countries, and the perceptions towards it are changing. What do you think should the positions of the church and maybe religious scholars in Islam should be towards change and their perception towards homosexuality? Do you think people should accept the fact that we can have maybe gay priests and in Islam, for example, do you think the perception towards homosexuality should change? Should they be accepted in the sense that they should be allowed to maybe get married in the community, even though maybe Islam doesn't favor gay marriage, but should it be acceptable in Muslim communities for homosexuals to change to get married? Is this change going to happen? Thank you.
So, an easy question for you both.
Well,
First with the poison.
I'll respond. I mean, I really can't speak for the Islamic community, being a Christian theologian, but I would say it's always helpful to talk about these issues. And I think that I'm a firm believer in the talking cure. And at this point, I use that just because it's part of the spectrum of contemporary Christian theology. It's called queer theology. And it's particularly strong within the Protestant tradition. There are a few instances I've come across it in Eastern Orthodoxy, but the Orthodox would take, if you follow the news, a far more conservative stance on this matter. And indeed, the official Catholic Church would take an official, a more strict stance on this. But I do think that one needs to respond to contemporary scientific kind of advances that I mean, these are obviously debatable, that say that there may be some genetic basis for this. One needs to respond and one needs to talk. And I think this is always a healthy thing, just speaking about the Christian context. So, for example, I am a part of a very conservative church, the Orthodox Church, which, I mean, indeed is not a Western church. It comes from the Middle East. And this church, one of the things that is starting to happen with the theologians is they're seeing our Catholic and Protestant brothers and sisters talking about this. So I'm a part of a group called the Logos Group, and we just did a volume that's coming out on war and peace in the Orthodox tradition, different kind of perspectives from that, from biblical scholars, from systematicians and different things. And the next one that we're talking about is doing one on homosexuality and on gay persons, and what is a theological response to that. So from a conservative tradition to a conservative tradition, it's always healthy to talk.
Yeah. I'd rather keep quiet on this issue because the discussion, I would say, is just starting on this issue, and you get surprised by some Muslim views as well, especially in Scandinavian countries and UK, because their context has put them in really tough situations where, other than the human rights debates, they have to make decisions. I mean here the offers, for instance, from the homosexual community to support certain directives in Brussels in exchange for some sort of cooperation, So, and when you know that homosexuals will get what they want anyway, but you have a chance if you show some level of acceptance that what Muslims want from Brussels might pause. If they do that, then you are in a real tough situation. And what I have heard from Muslims there is the following. They try to distinguish two things: homosexuality and acceptance of homosexuality and acceptance of homosexuals. Probably I'm not an expert on these issues, so this might be too simplistic, but this is how I understood it. What I mean is that they basically try to deal with homosexuality like with any other sin. So we have people who do zina, who do adultery, who drink, who break other norms of Islamic law and ethics, but we still keep dealing with them, and we do deals, and especially if they are in power, we don't mind. And then when it comes to homosexuals, somehow it becomes very sensitive and so on. So these people are reasoning that, you just treat this like any other. Of course, when it comes to family, that becomes completely another issue. But if we are talking about accepting homosexuals and not harassing them and these issues, then I see some Muslim groups in moving into that direction without, of course, talking at all about acceptability of homosexuality. That's a different issue, like alcohol, like adultery, like all these others. You don't have to change your position on that in order to change your attitude or behavior towards people who probably are involved in that. So this much, I think I would stop here.
It's a question for Dr. Gallagher, a slightly easier question, I think. Thank you for the very helpful kind of mapping of the tension between ecclesiology ad intra and ad extra, and church's communion and church's liberation. I just wondered if you had any reflections on where within that baptism sits, which is not only a major ecclesiological theme, but one on which there is a degree of ecumenical convergence, I think. And could I also say, just as a footnote, certainly the Church of England, I think the Anglican Communion, the practice is not to invite all to the Lord's table, but all baptised Christians, which does give some sort of sense of a limit.
A baptism ecclesiology. In fact, one of my teachers, a man called John Erickson, proposed such an ecclesiology where the church is defined by its triune confession in baptism. And this is remembered and celebrated and enacted in every Eucharist. And indeed, I think Baptism Eucharist Ministry, this key kind of text, which, not the Catholic Church officially, but at least as observers signed off on, would point to that. But in terms of trying to understand this as a basis for intercommunion, I don't think it solves that dilemma. But it certainly is something that can be built on. But I don't think, unless somebody writes some groundbreaking work, that it's going to replace communion ecclesiology. Communion ecclesiology at this point is simply almost become the universal Christian ecclesiology. And so I can't see that it would, other than being a way of clarifying or qualifying aspects of that ecclesiology, that it would, as it were, take over. But this aspect of baptism becomes key when you're trying to acknowledge the ecclesiality, the fact that if something is a church or not. So one thinks of a very classic text for this would be, in the 4th century, would be Basil the Great's canonical epistle, where he looks at all sorts of canonica prima, where he looks at all sorts of sort of quasi-Christian groups and says, how do you receive these different groups? Well, for Gnostic ones, they require rebaptism because they're just so bizarre. And but others are received through confession, through an early form of chrismation or confession in the West. And so this points to the fact that the church is acknowledging that there is a church outside the church, as it were. Or, there's two ways of viewing this. Either there's a church outside the church, or there are Christians who somehow have some relationship to the church. And there are different takes on this. I don't know if that responds.
Thank you both for illuminating grids of different attempts to fulfill a quite difficult task of remaining true to a tradition in changing circumstances. Grids, I think, can be very helpful, but they can also be quite dangerous, and they can tempt us into imagining, and I think there's sort of hints of this in both of your presentations, of trying to find a sort of a perfectly poised, balanced midpoint between the extremes which the grids can maybe map for us. Whereas I wonder whether what they maybe should be pointing towards for us is the sense in which we need to keep trying to do things which appear to be contradictory, staying true to the old but doing it in a new way, to do both of those fully, to be ad extra and intra, to be true to the inner essence and to the outer purpose, to be maintaining fidelity but in new senses, and that actually that would be part of what the grids in fact encourage us towards and challenge us towards, is a very different type of performance and poise for the community of actually trying to do all of these things fully rather than wend a kind of a pencil-thin line between various frightening extremes.
I think you're making reference to the last part of my paper. What I'm making reference here to is, lay my cards on the table, I'm thinking of Balthasar's notion of polarity, so that you have that what creativity, what truth consists of is a holding intention of poles. Although I use this idea of sort of sailing between a Scylla and Charybdis, which is probably not the best way of putting it. But I think that within Christian theology, one of the creative ways of approaching truth, of trying to find a response to the contemporary situation, is to see truth is a holding intention of two affirmations that are apparently contradictory, but through what one would call in the Russian tradition a podvig of faith, a spiritual feat or act of faith, you're able to hold them in tension, so that you don't, as it were, negate anything, but are able to integrate this ever more into your life. And so with each new situation, you try to hold these things in tension and try to, as it were, go forward to where, somebody was talking about the spirit before, where the spirit is moving the body, insofar as the body is an animated body, which must respond to the world.
I have two questions still to Ahmed. The first is, our topic is the community of believers. May there be perhaps a kind of tension to focus the Arab Spring, which is also, first of all, a transformation of political systems in which religion is only one factor. And the second question, do you think you could also apply the two perspectives we had already several times this morning in relation to Christian thought, the perspective ad intra and ad extra, to Islamic thought on this topic, and what might be the consequences of the Arab Spring for the ad intra perspective on Islamic community of believers?
Thank you, Hans. The reason I focused on the Arab Spring because it's really very dramatic, and I think the consequences are far-reaching. And the other reason is, I think we mentioned it in the break, you know, when we speak about the community, in classical Islamic sources, we very often actually don't discuss ummah that much, or Jama'at al-Muslimin. We discuss Khilafah and Imamah. So this is what the discussion about community, and where the discussion ends up actually. It ends up in the Khilafah and Imamah, because from there comes everything, you know. That's the fountainhead of authority in the community. So everything revolves around those issues. So even in that sense, I think I can be justified in choosing to, but that wasn't my reason. My primary reason was that this is really such a huge change that, you know, one cannot skip. As for the other question, yeah, this is really, of course, it can be related, and but I haven't followed closely these issues and how they are affected by ongoing changes. We know that some of the movements and leaders involved in the Arab Spring have been talking about this extra, you know, perspective, and have actually contributed to the change in the Muslim understanding, self-understanding, and, you know, the position they ascribe to others. And I know that Arab Spring has put a lot of pressure, further pressure on Muslim authorities to more clearly, you know, explicate how they view others and how they see the Ummah. You remember when, for instance, certain Egyptian Muslim groups spoke about our brothers Copts. Certain Copt groups said, we don't want to be brothers and sisters, we want to be fellow citizens, because that means something, you know, in legal terms. Forget about brotherhood and sisterhood. So, but frankly, I haven't followed that particular issue, you know, in connection with the Arab Spring. So